right, hello and welcome back to another episode of Drive with Me. So today I wanted to talk about, funnily enough, capitalism and the American variety of it, as well as the nature of what is often called socialism, what it is, per my understanding, versus how it is often described colloquially here in the United States, and how the two are actually mixed in the modern United States, right? So that's one of the first major points, is that we are not a fully dedicated capitalist system. We're not here in the modern United States of 2026. And the reality of any economic system is it is created and driven by humans, and the rules are created by humans. It is not something that's found in nature. So there's this argument that the free market will do its thing, right? But the reality is the free market is at best one generation long, right? The first generation, if everything's an equal playing field, the first generation gets to set up their rules, their expectations by the end of that generation, because some will be successful and some will not. It's kind of like where the way that certain regions are more productive agriculturally, or certain end up being really good for developing industry, or certain areas host larger populations like China or India or around the Mediterranean basin or what have you, versus others. Some have a lot of like disease pressure, like a lot of the tropics, right? Part of the reason why, even though humans really like the generally like your tropical islands and locations, the reality is it's difficult often to host very large populations in those areas because of a lot of tropical diseases. And it's part of the reason why historically you've had larger populations in more northern climates, just due to the fact that there's less disease pressure, right? And similarly, one of the big things that help civilization develop is rivers, right? Navigable rivers. And during the ice ages that we've had, as glaciers have expanded and they've receded, they cut major ways that help create more flat, navigable, good rivers, primarily in areas that they come into contact with in the northern and or far southern hemisphere. And so a lot of the tropical zones were never really scraped glacially, and so the ability for humans to really develop big civilizations in the tropics has long been kind of hindered. It's part of the reason why, like, sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is, I think, one major navigable river, and even then it's not through the entirety of it. It has a lot of wild ups and downs, really big gradients in terms of elevation changes, some really hard hitting like passes, certain areas with really big rapids and so on. And so it's difficult for commercial shipping to really get going there. And it's been that way for a long time. So while modern like evolutionary biologists and so on believe that our species primarily developed, I mean, it was a bit of an in and out. It's in waves, and it depends on what you define as us, whether you're talking about Australopithecus or Homo erectus or Neanderthalis or Homo sapiens, us. But there's generally an out of Africa theory that humans primarily developed, and the great apes that were human-like, or our earlier archaic humans, developed primarily in Africa and then spread out in a variety of waves. And some of them even turned around and came back, because that's the reality, is that a lot of life is more instead of calling it the tree of life, it's more like the really complicated web of life, because there's a lot of diverging and then coming back in various population sizes and so on. So anyway, while we seem to have generally developed in Africa, we also did not do best in Africa. So funnily enough, a lot of our major population centers, that as we see today, developed outside of Africa. So in the subcontinent of India, in East Asia, like around China, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, etc., right? Those were often places for a variety of reasons where agriculture was easier, industry was easier, there was less disease pressure. And even though there's lots of war in a lot of these regions, because that's just kind of typical of humanity, we had a lot of, or just easier success in other places, even in the Americas, right? Like the Mayans and I mean, later you would have like the Incans and the Aztecs, but even the Olmecs and some of the earlier peoples, right? Even though they had a much greater distance and less time to build up population in the Western Hemisphere than the old world peoples did. So they were at kind of a disadvantage in regards to developing, or the need to develop, technology as quickly. Nonetheless, they still found spots that were often easier to host civilization and agriculture and stuff in than much of sub-Saharan Africa had, and still has to this day. So it's interesting to see how that works. All that to say, the world is not an equal playing field. That was the whole point of all of this, right? Is the world itself is not an equal playing field for hosting human civilization in general from the get-go. So that inherently creates an apples to oranges kind of comparison. Then on top of that, you have human rules and expectations and the reality of might makes right that is really personified a lot of human history, right? That the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, as was said by, I want to say it was an ancient Greek or Roman philosopher. I don't remember exactly who, but nonetheless, that is the kind of world that we've traditionally lived in, and just in some respects, many respects, we still live in today. The reality is the United States and the West is the dominant player economically and militarily in the world. Like, the collective alliance really is the dominant player, and China is mostly rising by taking advantage of it and playing within those rules just enough that it's able to greatly benefit from it, but also trying to, over time, slowly create an alternate system through things like the BRICS alliance, right? Which is what they seem to be hoping to do eventually. So you've got a scenario wherein certain spots are just better for hosting populations than others, and the nature of those that are stronger and able to develop systems that dominate others love to extract from those that can't stop them. And you have literally millennia of this happening. And that brings us to the modern day, this what we would generally consider a post-colonial, post-World War II, American-led system. And we then have created this mythology that capitalism is, we call it the free market, the invisible hand of the free market, right? As I believe Adam Locke said. And that actually really ignores the notion that there is almost always what is called a sovereign or some kind of regulatory oversight body over the course of trade and economics. There just always is. And in fact, for trade to be successful, especially on any kind of large scale, it often needs to be done with oversight and protections, whether it's intellectual property, whether it's enforcing rules, whether it's protecting from bandits, right? There's any number of things that trade is best done in a fairly well-organized system. So the nature of keeping the government out and letting business do its thing is, one, not a new idea, and two, we've done it multiple times in the United States before to varying degrees of success, and it always leads to wealth concentrating at the top. In fact, the era known as the Gilded Age, right, in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, is often called that because it was an era of intense wealth concentration at the top that led to what was seen as rot culturally and morally from the inside, that was then called gilded, meaning that it had the surface layer of gold but wasn't nearly as good on the inside, right? And we're experiencing something akin to that again in the modern United States. We are in what some may be able to call, and what may be called in the future, a second Gilded Age. This one definitely has some differences with the previous one. However, it carries a lot of similarities. An emphasis on free trade that really means those with power start to influence the way trade goes far more effectively and far more staunchly than your average individual. Labor and workers' rights slowly get eroded, and families start to lose buying power over time. And many of the same trends you saw back then, you're seeing now. And after the Great Depression, that was kind of the final runoff of it that really tanked this nation. In 1929, we entered a new era, right? And around that time, right, late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a gentleman named William Jennings Bryan, and he was an avowed socialist, right? And since the rise of the communist parties in both Russia and in China, socialism, which it has been directly linked to in the minds of Americans, has been deigned effectively a dirty word. And the wealthy have very much taken advantage of it. They love that because we see it as an all-encompassing economic, social, religious, like it's a system that we see communism as, even though that's not how it was originally described by like Karl Marx, for example, who wrote the Communist Manifesto. And socialism as a general idea goes back to utopian socialism that existed in the medieval era, and that intended to have like communes and basically a collection of homesteads of families that wanted to live more like Christ and more like early Christians and separate from the world. That was the idea with socialism, but that then these families would trade amongst themselves to make sure everybody had what they needed. That was the ideal with utopian socialism. So that's where a lot of that comes from. And so they've kind of become entangled, and in modern America, socialism tends to equal bad, especially if you're over the age of like 50, 55. And basically meaning you grew up and have a memory of the Cold War between the US and the USSR. And so anyway, if you're younger than that, though, a lot of us younger generations, like I was born in the late 80s, I don't really remember that. And I've had a much more positive view of the New Deal era, right? The United States between roughly the early 1930s, when FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, was first elected after the Great Depression kicked off, and up until roughly the late 1970s, before the Reagan Revolution really ushered in and solidified our modern neoliberal system as the current way of thought in American politics, right? And so that era, and particularly from 1945, the end of World War II, through roughly the 1970s, is often called the golden age of capitalism because it was regulated. And you saw a massive expansion, a massive investment in building out a middle class, right? Through the GI Bill that helped soldiers returning from World War II get inexpensive or less expensive housing, to help getting educational like stipends and loans and so on, so they could go to college, and a massive build out of white collar jobs, right? But also for a while there, industrial jobs. And so all Americans, basically of every social class, were doing better for a while. We actually changed the dynamic that had existed throughout most of human history, which is might makes right, and those at the top generate the most wealth, and that is typically how things have gone. And even if they generated the most wealth, at least the others, everybody else was, or almost everybody else, was getting a majority of the pie, or a majority of people were getting a piece of the pie, more or less commensurate to the effort and knowledge and, expertise that they brought to the table. There were exceptions. America was definitely more racist back then, so black people were largely kept out of that, or at least held down dramatically. So were many people that were East Asian and Latin American and so on, right? Basically anybody that wasn't primarily Northern European, right, in terms of descent. Even for quite a while, you had those among like Southern European groups, right? Up until relatively recently, Italians and Polish folks and your Eastern Europeans, like your Russians and so on, were often treated very skeptically. And famously, the Irish, when they came over, were not treated well at all, and were often literally told at the door that they were not welcome for certain jobs. And they would put up signs, like shopkeepers, Irish need not apply, and so on, right? So there's been America is really good at discriminating against people of all types. However, it's pretty undeniable that Native Americans and African Americans have had among the worst time, just straight up. There really is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And to varying degrees, we've started collectively adjusting and accounting for this, but far from what I would consider a truly fair system or truly corrected system. It's just better than it used to be, by a notable margin, admittedly. Same thing for women, right? Like, I wouldn't call us an equal society between males and females by any stretch, but it is quite a bit better than it used to be. And in fact, there can be an argument to be made that some parts of feminism even went a little overboard. And I've heard many of those arguments myself, and like, you know what, there may be something to trying to advocate for having more traditional families, because especially in this era of more and more wealth getting generated and being sucked up to the top, traditional family units is largely how you keep wealth and build it for yourself, right? There's a reason why that's what we stuck with for so long as a human culture and civilization and collection of civilizations, because you see it across civilizations, right? Whether they be Chinese or Roman or Mughal or sub-Saharan African or any number of others, right? It's just what you see because it's one of the most efficient systems for generating wealth and keeping it within a specific family to make sure that your family, your offspring are taken care of and to the best of your ability, right? So anyway, I think part of the reason why there's this like nostalgia for homesteading and so on, and a lot of DIY stuff and crafting and cooking and, you know, like canning and preserving stuff, and a lot of this aesthetic that we see on social media for just a more traditional life, crocheting and knitting and sewing and all sorts of stuff, right? A lot of that seems to just come down to the fact that we increasingly feel collectively out of touch with the monetary culture and the material culture that we have around us, and we want to return to something simpler and something that feels more real and predictable and something more achievable and something that we can increasingly control and enjoy without feeling like we're constantly having to pay more money for inferior products and or less of it, right? So all of that to say, capitalism doesn't happen in a vacuum. Socialism is a dirty word in the modern United States, and hopefully that will continue changing because it is way more complex than that. And the reality is since the basically the early 1930s, we have had a version of democratic socialism in the United States anyway, right? Through our social security programs, through Medicare and Medicaid, through our WIC, food stamps programs and all sorts of other stuff, right? Any kind of, I mean, honestly, even our mortgage pricing, right? The like first time home buyers and our 1081 tax exchanges and all sorts of different things that we do, even for the middle and upper middle classes that they take advantage of, or the FDIC having insured and guaranteed by the government, bank deposits up to a certain amount that largely benefit the wealthy nowadays. All sorts of these programs are inherently more socialist or covering for people as a lender or a guarantor of money of last resort, putting that in the hands of the government because that is where we have collective power and trust. Generally, not like it's a lot lower than it used to be, but nonetheless, it's still far less likely that the government of the United States goes bankrupt than any given individual in the United States, which is why it's safer to invest in U.S. Treasury bonds than it is to invest in specific people by and large. So that when you combine all of this together and the fact that billionaires have collectively gobbled up basically all of the media apparatus, social and traditional, in this nation, and they control a huge amount of the narrative, and they purposely bifurcate and then buy off politicians, and then politicians play into these same narratives and tell us that it's all left versus right and red versus blue or black versus white or brown versus black or whatever the heck the case may be. The reality is we've been sitting here with the answers the entire time. Like our generations ago, we figured this stuff out, right? A labor movement helped give us 40-hour work weeks and 2-day weekends and so on, and guaranteed holidays and overtime pay and all of this. All of that was fought for. That was not given to workers. That was fought for. Much like women's voting rights and in general civil rights and so on, right? So these things are all concepts and facets of our society and our reality that were fought for and were worked hard for, and in many cases died, people died for this. And so you have a huge amount of appreciation in this country that we should have for those that came before us. And I think we need to be remind ourselves, remind each other that socialism, as it is often defined now, is often what saved a lot of us. Our collective bargaining, our collective protesting, and our collective anger and demand for change is what's made this nation better. In fact, it triggered a whole civil war. It triggered multiple civil rights movement. Every positive change, every woke movement that we've ever had has been on the backs of those that were angry enough to demand change and were told they should sit down and shut up, or stand up and shut up. Either way. Nonetheless, we should be collectively angry. It doesn't mean you can't be at peace yourself. It doesn't mean you can't accept things you can't change. It doesn't mean you can't try to have the most peaceful existence for yourself and your family that you can have, but you can do that alongside educating yourself and realizing that this system is screwed up and we need to change it. And the way to do that is to collectivize our power and our voices and bring them together, because how the wealthy get away with what they do, the ultra wealthy in particular, is by keeping us divided and in conflict, or in manufactured conflict with each other. So next time you hear Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or people on X or whatever talking about how terrible Republicans or Democrats are, remember it's mostly a smokescreen. And what matters is real change that benefits the rest of us. That economic systems in general do not happen in a vacuum, and they do not occur in nature. We build them, which means we can change them. So anyway, I'll go ahead and get off of my soapbox today, but we need more capitalism and a healthier view of socialism to realize that neither, and like sticking to terms and ideology, is friggin' pointless in this country. We need real, meaningful, positive change that helps people. And there are a number of ways to skin that particular cat, but we need to move in that direction. And the ones that are standing in our way are not primarily each other, those of us that are in the working classes. They're not your coworkers that disagree with you. They're not primarily your parents and siblings that maybe view Trump differently, positively or negatively, while you have taken the opposite view. It is primarily those way above any of us, people we often never hear about. Your DuPonts and your Waltons and your Rockefellers and so on, right? Your wealthy families that are multi-generational often, centibillionaires that put so much money into politics and at all levels that they control things we are not even aware of, and influence things we're not even aware of, and then convince us all that this is the natural way of things and how it should be. So anyway, if you made it this far, I appreciate it. Please feel free to like the video if you do, and otherwise, y'all take care. If you want to hear more about politics, economics, current events, etc., feel free to stick around because we'll be talking more about it. Y'all have a good one.